Welcome to Wheelock's Latin, Chapter 17. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at the relative pronoun of the Latin language, and we'll also be looking at diagramming relative clauses. All right, so what is a relative pronoun? Well, if you remember from your study of the English language maybe a few years ago, a relative pronoun introduces a subordinate clause and refers back to some noun or pronoun known as its antecedent. The relative clause itself has an adjectival function providing the descriptive information about the antecedent. You'll translate the relative pronoun like who or whom, which, or even that. The forms in Latin are quite varied, and so you're going to have to memorize these. The genitive and dative singular are going to be similar to the pattern of the genitive and dative of the hic, haec, hoc demonstrative pronoun ele, ela, elud, and este, esta, estud. But other than that, it will basically represent resemble, the first and second declension adjective forms. So let's look at an example of a relative pronoun in an English sentence. The poet, who was from Rome, loved the girl. Now here we have who was from Rome. This is the relative clause. The relative pronoun is who. The antecedent of who, in other words, who is who referring to, is poet. And so you've got the relative pronoun who, the antecedent poet. So the main sentence itself is the poet loved the girl. That's the main sentence. The relative clause, or sometimes referred to as a subordinate clause, is who was from Rome. And the relative pronoun, again, is referring back to its antecedent, who is the poet. All right? So this is the basic form and function of a relative pronoun and a relative clause. Let's look at the Latin forms. Here is the chart, and it is something that you're going to have to memorize because it is a little irregular. But that being said, you will be able to see similarities, as I mentioned a minute ago. It does basically follow the pattern of first and second declension adjectives, the us, a, you will see that in the forms here. But it also follows the pattern of hic, haec, hoc, ele, ela, elud, and este, esta, estud, the demonstrative pronouns, where in the genitive it has an ius across all three masculine, feminine, and neuter singular forms, and an I in the masculine, feminine, neuter dative forms. So let's look at these. Now, I always tell my students in these forms, in the singular, we memorize across, left to right, masculine, feminine, neuter. It just seems to be easier. So here we have qui, quai, quod. Say that with me. Qui, quai, quod. Say that a couple more times. Qui, quai, quod. The QU functions together as a unit, grammatically speaking. So it's all one sound. Qui, qui. Qui is the full form, but that QU forms one unit. Qui, quai, quod. Now, in the genitive, it shifts and the dative to a C and a CU, plus the ending IUS. So it's quis. It's like a CU, then a YUS. Quis, 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 masculine, feminine, neuter. And then in the dative, qui, qui, qui. Now, in the accusative, it flips back to the Q, so you end up with a quem, quam, quod. And you can kind of see remnants of the first and second declension adjective here. Normally, masculine in the accusative singular ends with a UM. It does become an EM here. However, in the feminine singular accusative, you do see the AM ending. And of course, our neuter rule is whatever's in the nominative will also be in the accusative form. So that should not give you any difficulties if you remember that rule. So it's quod in the neuter accusative singular. Now, when you drop down to the ablative, you have your typical endings O, A, and O. So that gives us quo, qua, quo. All of these having the macron over them. So one more time. Qui, quai, quod. Quis, quis, quis. Qui, qui, qui. Quem, quam, quod. Quo, qua, quo. Now in the plural form, you essentially have the, again, first and second declension adjective endings in masculine, feminine, neuter. The is in the dative and active plural shifts to what we see regularly happens to some forms to an ibus, So this shouldn't be problematic for you. So we'll memorize these going down because these forms seem to be fairly simple this way. Qui, quorum, quibus, quos, quibus. And then the feminine plural, quae, quorum, quibus, quas, quibus. And in the neuter plural, quae, quorum, quibus, quae, quibus. Now, if there's anything that's going to cause you problems, it's the form QUAE. As you can see, it appears in neuter, nominative plural. It also appears in the neuter accusative plural, which we see that typically. Neuter has the same form in nominative and accusative, but that same form is also in feminine singular, nominative, and feminine plural, nominative. So there's 4 different places. The best thing I can tell you is just remember this. If you see QUAE, it's either going to be nominative, it's either feminine, nominative singular, feminine, nominative plural, or neuter, nominative plural, or there's a possibility it is neuter, accusative plural. But those are the 2 spots you're going to see it in nominative and accusative. So it's either going to be your subject or your direct object most likely. So if you keep that in mind, it shouldn't give you too many problems. So you're going to have to memorize these forms. Just going to have to take the time to memorize them, say them over and over again. I would highly recommend writing them out on a couple of different occasions to help you get them locked down. Now, here's an example of a relative pronoun in use in a Latin sentence. We looked at a sentence a minute ago in English. The poet who was from Rome loved the girl. Well, we're going to put this into Latin. Poeta qui ex Roma erat puellam amavit. Now, frequently, the relative clause is separated from the rest of the sentence with punctuation, specifically commas. And when that happens, it's very easy to see the relative clause. It's subordinate to the main sentence. Here, the main sentence is poeta puellam amavit. The poet loved the girl. What we have here is qui ex Roma erat functioning as a relative clause. Here's the English translation. The poet who was from Rome loved the girl. There is the relative clause. Here is the relative clause in the Latin. There we go. Qui ex Roma erat. Relative pronoun is qui. Translates to who. There we go. Apparently it's asking me to advance these individually. And the antecedent for qui is poeta. And in English, of course, poet. That's the antecedent. It's who the who is referring to. And it is poeta and poet. Now, something to keep in mind here regarding the form of the relative pronoun. In this case, qui is going to be masculine singular because qui has to agree with its antecedent, in this case, poeta, which is masculine and singular. Poeta is masculine singular, so qui has to be masculine and singular. However, there you go. There's the antecedent. However, it's going to be nominative because qui functions as the subject of the subordinate or relative clause. So it's just coincidental here that poeta is nominative and qui is nominative, but you won't always see that. The relative pronoun could be any case separate from whatever the case of its antecedent, because it's going to be determined, the case will be determined by how it's functioning in the sentence. In this case, it is the subject of erat, who was from Rome. It is the subject of erat. Qui is the subject of erat. So that's the reason why it's nominative. Let's look at a couple of rules here. All right. So as I mentioned, the relative pronoun must agree with its antecedent in gender and in number. However, the case of the relative pronoun will be determined by its function within the subordinate clause. If it's the subject, it will be in the nominative case. If it's the direct object of that relative clause, then it will be the accusative case, etc. You keep those in mind and you'll be able to determine where the relative pronoun fits. Now, we've dabbled in diagramming sentences, some in class, and I think diagramming sentences is important because it helps give a visual structure to the sentence. As our sentences become more complex, sometimes it's helpful to look at them almost in a picture form, and that helps you to see how different words function and are related in a sentence. So let's look at the first part of this sentence here. The poet loved the girl. Poeta amavit puellam. You've got the horizontal line for the sentence. You've got poeta and the subject and the verb, poeta and amawit, separated by a vertical line that crosses the horizontal line. Puelam, the direct object, is separated from the verb with a vertical line, but notice that that line does not bisect the horizontal line. It stops. So there's your main sentence, subject, verb, direct object. Now the relative clause is a separate sentence. It's a separate clause. It's dependent or subordinate to the main sentence. In other words, it doesn't stand on its own. Who was from Rome does not stand on its own. It's dependent on being a part of the main sentence. Poeta, amawit, puelam. So here again, we're going to have qui because it's the subject. It'll be separated by its verb, arat, a linking verb with a horizontal line that bisects the main line. And then we've got a prepositional phrase in the ablative, ex Roma, that comes underneath arat. It is essentially modifying. It's an adverbial prepositional phrase that modifies as the linking verb arat. So this is our subordinate clause. Qui arat ex Roma. And the two sentences, their sentence and the subordinate clause, are connected with a dashed line. So that's how we diagram it. So now you can see how these two sentences sort of stand on their own. It gives you a picture and how they're related to one another. Let's look at another example here. Femina quam laudas est sapiens. Here we have the main sentence, femina est sapiens. The woman is wise. But the relative clause is quam laudas, whom you are praising. It is describing the woman. It is giving us more information about its antecedent, in this case, the woman. So whom you are praising, quam laudas, is the relative clause. There we go. And again, fortunately, it is set off by commas. It makes it easy to identify. It won't always be that way. Now, again, relative pronoun is quam. Translation is whom. And the antecedent is femina in the Latin. And the translation, of course, is the woman. Now, what about the form of qui quid quod? How did we get quam? Well, because its antecedent is feminine and singular, then the relative pronoun has to be feminine and singular. In this case, it is accusative, feminine and singular, quam. But why is it accusative? Again, it's not based, the case of the relative pronoun is not based on its antecedent. Only the number and gender is based on the antecedent. Here, the case is based on how it functions in the relative clause. Quam laudas. Laudas is you praise. Quam, you praise whom. So here, quam is the direct object, so it'll be in the accusative. So again, feminine singular because quam has to agree with its antecedent, femina, which in this case is feminine and singular. There we go. However, it's accusative because quam functions as the direct object of the subordinate clause, laudas quam. Let's, again, look at this in diagram form to help us see how this functions together. Femina is our subject. In the subject spot, you've got est, the linking verb here, again, separated by a bisecting line. Sapiens is a predicate adjective, meaning wise. Here we're going to have a slanted line that sort of points back towards the subject which it's describing. Sapiens is describing femina. The woman is wise. That's the main sentence. But then we have the relative clause here, or the subordinate clause. The subject is inferred by the ending of the verb. Laudas, the letter S, of course, is our second person singular present ending. So for our verbs. So laudas is the verb. The ending is included. So I just put an X to sort of give you a holding spot there for the subject. And then quam is separated from laudas with a vertical line, not bisecting the horizontal line. It's functioning as our direct object. And here I have a dashed line that it goes from quam to its antecedent, femina. And now you can see the picture of how these two sentences work, or the main sentence and its subordinate clause, and how they are related to one another. So this is our relative clauses and relative pronouns. I'd encourage you to work on memorizing that form, or I should say those forms. Don't forget to work on your vocabulary. We will have a quiz later this week. Have a good night.